Hi everyone. In today's video, I want to answer a question that I got from a reader. This was in response to my last video that I did, where I talk about trend lines in American society and how they might impact high-achieving minority groups. And one of the things that I talk about in the recommendation portion of that members in American society who are part of high-achieving minority groups should think carefully about potentially renouncing their citizenship. And this is a theme that this idea of renouncing U.S. citizenship is one that I've talked about and written about at length over the past couple of years. But I received a question from a reader, and he wrote, very thought-provoking. I wonder how the mainstream will react to the citizenship renouncement idea. So this is a topic that I've been thinking about for some time, and the way that I began to think about it was in the course of writing a couple articles about tax cuts and trends of taxation in American society. Now, right after the 2016 elections, I wrote a piece for my former employer. I have it here in the National Interest. Do Republicans really want tax cuts? And I made a prediction in the article, which was that at a time where we have unified Republican government and people are embracing for a large tax cut, my prediction actually was that the Republicans, despite having unified control of the government, despite making tax reform a feature of their plans, their campaign promise, actually would not really have a mandate to cut taxes on the personal side. I thought on the corporate side, there would be an impetus for cutting taxes, but not on the personal side, because as I talk about in the article, the reality is that the Republican Party, if you look at where their voters are coming from, they're actually not really paying taxes in any meaningful respect. And that prediction proved basically to be correct, where we ended up getting a large reduction in the corporate tax rate. But if you look on the individual side, on the personal income side, I think objectively what Republicans did was actually consolidate political support for what was in fact a historic tax increase under the Obama years. One of the most remarkable things to me is the fact that when you look at the original bill that passed the House of Representatives, the Republican-controlled House, they voted to keep the upper income rate at the Obama level, and it was only after a push by a few Republican members of the Senate that they cut the top rate down from like 39% to 38.4, or something just symbolic and basically marginal. So then, when this prediction came true, I then began to ask the question, well, if we are at a period now where we're going to see probably higher and higher taxes on the wealthy, why aren't more Americans talking about and thinking about actually renouncing their U.S. citizenship? And the reason that question needs to be asked is because the U.S. where that has citizenship-based taxation. So in other words, as long as you have an American passport, as long as you're an American citizen, it doesn't matter where in the world you are or what you're doing, you have to file a tax return and you're on the hook with the IRS. So I wrote a follow-on article of sort. This is in the American Conservative here. Title is, Will High Taxes Force the Rich to Leave America? And one of the things that I had to grapple with when I wrote this article was that, on the one hand, my intuition was correct in that higher taxes and so forth were in fact leading to a flood of people who are renouncing their citizenship. And I talk about that in the article. People like Eduardo Saverin, the founder of Facebook, renounced his citizenship. Tina Turner, the famous singer, ended up renouncing. Roger Ver, a big name in the Bitcoin community, renounced. And if you look at the rate and the percentage at which Americans are renouncing their citizenship, presumably in large part for tax reasons, these numbers are skyrocketing as on a percent basis. But the reality is that the overall numbers, the absolute numbers of people who are doing this actually remains quite small. And as the reader here, I think, is alluding, to answer the question directly, how will the mainstream react to their citizenship? I suspect that they probably won't react at all. I mean, I follow this area fairly closely, and I'm always on the lookout for articles in mainstream media or discussion by major influencers and politicians, and they really don't. I mean, it remains a narrow niche industry of people who've been talking about it. I think the question deserves more digging. Why is this possibility, this idea of Americans renouncing their citizenship, why is it not a matter of mainstream discussion? So I want to offer 5 theories on why this might be, but I don't actually really know the answer here, and I'd welcome other alternatives. But number 1 is that renouncing U.S. citizenship simply might not make sense for the vast majority of Americans, and the reason is, in large part, has to do with how progressive our tax system is, and that in combination with how large and generous of a government we have in terms of the services it provides for people and so forth. So, as these numbers are out there, basically, if you look at who is actually footing the tax bill, a very, very small number of people, very top, like the top 1% of taxpayers pay something like 40% of federal income tax revenues. So the reality is that the vast majority of people simply are benefiting far more from government services, from the tax system, than they're putting into it. So why would they renounce their citizenship? Number 2 is the what I would call stake in American society. So this idea of renouncing U.S. citizenship for the tax benefits is really only a concern potentially for people who are either already very wealthy and have assets to protect, or people who want to become wealthy very quickly. But here you find a paradox where the people who basically there are 2 people who get hurt by the tax code. One are people who are already very wealthy, and these are people who have to preserve and consolidate their wealth. They have to think about passing down their wealth, and I've written in another article how this idea of international diversification is actually a very prominent feature for families that are trying to pass down their wealth and estates and so forth. So that's the top category, but then the second category are people who are trying to become wealthy. And the people who really get hit the hardest by the tax code are people who are high earners, but high earners in a salary job. And basically what happens when you're in a high salary job is that your paycheck gets deducted. So you can't really, by your employer automatically, so you can't even really do much with that money. And then like throughout the year when you're earning it, and then you actually have to file your tax return and pay by rates. Now, I think one of the reasons, so if these are the 2 categories of people who obviously are getting hurt by the tax code, this idea of renouncing citizenship is a live question for them, and yet they don't do it. And the question is why. I think one of the reasons is that beyond a certain level of wealth, especially if you have your wealth in different areas, whether it's in real estate or capital gains or whatever else, there actually are like tax cutouts, carve-outs, and so forth, where if you hire a good accountant and whatever, you certainly can't get your tax rate down to anything to 0 or anywhere close, but you can actually get it down pretty low by using different deductions and so forth. And so then the question becomes, like, if you're a multi-millionaire and you're able through creative ways of deductions or whatever to get your tax rate down, let's say to 15 or 20% or whatever, then the question becomes, is that extra 15 or 20% you might save for citizenship and going abroad worth it? And a big part of and a lot of people answer the question no. And one of the reasons is because when you get to that level of wealth and that level, not only do you have wealth, but you also have a certain influence or stake or role in American society. You have a vested place in it, and there are other things that you want. So maybe that means getting involved with the politics of the country. Maybe it means being an influencer in some way. Maybe it means that you have other forms of capital invested in the country. So the tax rate that you're paying when you have that level of status in society becomes worth it, because if you renounce your US citizenship and you try to pack up and go abroad and create a new life somewhere else, you may be making more money, but you aren't going to have the same social status or role in a community abroad. But then the question becomes, well, what about this other category of people who are trying to get wealthy, the people who are really getting slammed with the tax code? And here, I think there's a different phenomenon, which is that actually they would benefit from renouncing and going abroad. So for example, if you're let's say a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or something, and especially when you're in a part of the country with a high cost of living, if you're paying upwards of 35, 40% and even higher in places like California or whatever, and then you're getting hit with a high cost of living, you actually could go abroad, you could renounce your US citizenship, and you could be on a similar path elsewhere and get actually a fairly large reduction in your taxes. But one of the realities is that the vast majority of people who are on that track, who are on that train, these are people who are there for a reason, and that reason is that they've fundamentally bought into the American system. These are the people who are the winners or winners of following a fairly conventional path in life. These are people who usually do well in school. They're usually not necessarily contrarians. They're people who basically view the system as being legitimate, or at least legitimate enough to devote their life doing it. And so they're just not in a mental headspace to even contemplate the question. And they go into these sorts of fields and whatever, and they basically accept the tax rate as a given. It's a mental and psychological limitation. Number three, which is related to that last point, is that the American brand is very strong. And so I've talked to a lot of people about this question who objectively would benefit from renunciation, or I've even asked the question, what would it take to start to contemplate renunciation? Like, how high would the tax rate have to go? How much regulation would there need to be? And I point out the fact that even our tax rates today, which I consider to be too high, are actually in a certain measure historically low. You guys might have seen that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is out there championing a 70% tax rate. It's easy to forget that's what the tax rate was on the eve of the Reagan Revolution. We had an upper tax rate of 70%. And in fact, the 70% was actually low when you look at what the rate was in the 50s and 60s. We did have an upper income rate actually even higher than that. And so, when conservatives kind of wax nostalgic about the 1950s and early 1960s, I mean, it's actually very funny. Because this was a period where Keynesian economics was in its heydays, where we had tax rates that today would be obscene even for a left-wing Democrat to advocate. But so the American, what I was getting at there is that when you have these conversations with people, at some point, what they basically say is, well, you're right. I could save a lot of money on taxes if I were to renounce my citizenship, but I don't want to do it. Because I feel loyal to America. I'm patriotic. I just have emotional ties to the country. And, there's obviously like a legitimate debate on whether or not patriotism and pride in the US is worthwhile and what the cost of that pride is. But one of the things that we have to consider is that it's not an accident that Americans have this pride in their country. It's not an accident that the American brand is so strong. It's not an accident that people have a hard time even contemplating the idea of renouncing their citizenship, and it's because we associate propaganda with authoritarian societies. Like, we all cringe and laugh when we look at old Soviet propaganda or whatever else. But the reality is that actually we're inundated by propaganda and marketing all the time. Anyone who goes to a public school, I remember you get up every morning and you pledge allegiance to the flag. We're always told that America is the best country in the world, which may be true. I actually think it probably is, but that doesn't answer the question of whether it's the best for you as an individual, even if it might be the best generally. If you look at our corporate marketing, a lot of it tries to tie its brand to a broader ethos in the country. If you look at major sporting events, they blare the national anthem, and then obviously there's a mythology. We're taught about our country and its wisdom and whatever. So the point is that America is a brand. It's a very successful exercise in marketing, and the reality is that when you think about the role of branding and marketing and the aspect of life, even those of us who aren't all that materialistic or whatever, we're obviously affected by brands. I mean, when you think about like the clothes you wear, the things you buy on a day-to-day basis, we don't buy them because they're the optimal thing for us. We buy them because good branding and good marketing makes it like a default choice, and it just becomes a sort of inertia that we don't necessarily question. Number four reason is genuine disagreement about trends in American society. In my last video, I paint a relatively pessimistic or dour prediction about where American society is heading and what that means for at least certain classes of people. But the reality is that there's a genuine debate about where American society is heading. And the reality is, especially in a society where, as I've talked about in other videos and other, where there, in mainstream society, there's really no premium or benefit to actually making accurate predictions and accurate forecasts. It's very easy to believe that things will get better, that trend lines will get better, that there will be ways to where the country's overall economic situation and system will improve and become better. And so even if one is not happy with their tax burden, even if there are other opportunities abroad, if one believes that trend lines will be better, that things will change, that new leadership in this country will somehow radically transform things, that obviously dampens the impetus for renouncing citizenship. And it's worth bearing in mind, I fully concede that I think, although I think that the US economy is not on a sound footing, and I think social and economic trends are not really good, one could have very easily made that prediction in the 60s and 70s, and people did make that prediction, but then we got the Reagan Revolution, we got massive deregulation of the financial sector. We did have innovation of the sorts that very few people contemplated. So I think there's actually a genuine disagreement here about trend lines in American society, and that obviously shapes the renunciation debate. And then number 5, and finally, is that renouncing citizenship is actually pretty hard to do. And it's hard to do because at the end of the day, although globalization has sort of accelerated in unprecedented ways, the reality is that the global visa regime, the passport situation, the citizenship situation, the obstacles traveling for different mechanisms with banking and so forth are actually pretty hard to navigate. And although there is a niche industry out there of experts and consultants and so forth, the people who specialize in wealth management and help people navigate this process, it's very hard to do. Basically, you have to grossly simplify it, you have to open foreign bank accounts, start moving your assets abroad. Then you have to basically get another passport, another citizenship. You have to think about whether this passport would allow you visa-free, easy visa travel to other places that you might care about. And then you have to go through the process of renouncing your citizenship, which is a whole nother thing. Then you have to do all of that, plus now go through the process of being an immigrant and resettling in another society. So it's a pretty hard thing to do. I mean, one of the theories that I have is one of the reasons why I think immigrants tend to be so overrepresented at higher levels of achievement across our society is because immigration is actually like a proxy for the people who can actually who have the ability and a track record of actually making a move from one place to the other, and they actually have the ability of getting things done and arranging all the logistics and so forth to actually make these changes. It's just really hard to do. It requires a very sophisticated knowledge and understanding of different processes and logistics and so forth, and then it also requires a lot of courage and other softer attributes that are required to do this. So those are I think the 5 main reasons why renunciation of U.S. citizenship is something that is not really talked about right now. My own view, though, is that this is probably a temporary thing. That I think there are a lot of different practices that's radical in one period, but within a few years become very mainstream. And I think that is probably what's likely to happen in the case of U.S. citizenship renunciation. And you can get an early taste of that if you look at this rise of digital nomad culture, for example, where you basically have entrepreneurs who make all their money online in a location-independent way. They're traveling around the world, or they're moving to places like Chiang Mai or whatever else, to basically take advantage of a lower cost of living and so forth. And it's I mean, it's not a stretch to think that someone who's a digital nomad in their 20s or 30s, when they're older and they're wealthier and they're really looking at their tax bill, they're already basically global citizens. They've already gone through this process. So renouncing citizenship would not necessarily be all that much of a stretch. You can also see it in retirees who are abroad. And you look at there are these very interesting subcultures of Americans who are retired in places like Costa Rica or Belize or whatever else. They may very well be at a place where they might renounce their citizenship. I also think, too, that if you look at who is wealthy in America and who's getting wealthy, a lot of these people are immigrants or people very close to the immigrant experience. And they're immigrants from non-Western cultures. They're people who came from places like Asia and whatever else. So they obviously have cultural and familial ties and so forth, and networks to other parts of the world. So the idea of the U.S. in some sense is an adopted land in the first place, and it wouldn't be all that hard for them to reactivate networks and resettle elsewhere in the world. And so I do think that although today this is not a major discussion in society, I do think my prediction that I'll make here is that in the coming years, maybe in like a 5 to 15-year, 20-year period, this will become much more of a common mainstream practice that people do. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll be interested if you agree or if you have a different view or take or prediction on this. Talk to you soon.